We're defending Gibeon. Chapter 10 makes a great companion to chapter 9 because all of those thorny questions that chapter 9 brought up for us on why exactly, or what exactly is Israel supposed to do with this situation that they're in, where they've made a covenant that they shouldn't have made, but they've invoked the name of God. All of these things, it's resolved somewhat by God giving some kind of a grudging stamp of approval here in chapter 10. That God tells them outright, yes, I will give you victory. Yes, you should go defend Gibeon. And even if the Gibeonites did this deceitfully, we're going to take their half-hearted way of seeking God and allow this to be an opportunity for some mercy. So we discussed last week how the Israelites marched all night long up those 3,400 feet and 17 miles to get to Gibeon to defend them against the 5 kings and 5 armies that had come to destroy Gibeon. And Joshua gets a victory over the first army that he runs across there on the road. And then he asks God a question, a request that has a lot of faith behind it, as he says, essentially, extend this day so that we can get the victory today that you have promised. And when you've hiked all night long, that is certainly a lot of faith to show that I'm willing to see this through today, and to know that even though we are more fatigued than our enemies are, that God is going to give us the victory anyway. So the sun stood still in the sky, the moon stood still in the sky, and they have this very long day as they are chasing the armies 20 miles down the road and routing them. I very quickly at the end of last week's lesson kind of rushed through how that day concluded. Probably going to take a minute here and talk about that in a little bit less of a rush, just so that we've got that down. But after they have fought these 5 armies and have defeated them, you remember that Joshua had trapped the 5 kings in a cave that they were hiding in. So they were there looking for a safe spot. And how did Joshua trap them in there? Yeah, it's kind of comical to me, actually. We just push a big rock in front of that and keep them there, post a guard outside, making sure that nobody comes to rescue them, and we'll deal with them after we've dealt with the armies. And that's a pretty useful thing, to take their leadership away from the 5 armies that are trying to attack Gibeon. So after they've defeated those armies, they go back to the cave. Verse 22 says, Joshua said, open the mouth of the cave, bring those 5 kings out to me from the cave. And they did so and brought those 5 kings out to him from the cave, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. When they had brought those kings out to Joshua, Joshua summoned all the men of Israel and said to the chiefs of the men of war who had gone with him, come near, put your feet on the necks of these kings. That is quite a mental image right there. Let's put our feet on their necks. That's representing a place of extreme power for the Israelites, right? That they're in the position that these powerful kings are completely helpless before them. Nobody gets in a position of having their neck stepped on by another person without being thoroughly conquered and thoroughly defeated in some sort of battle. And so the men of war, the leaders, are able to do this. And Joshua says, do not be afraid, this is verse 25, or dismayed. Be strong and courageous. We've seen that multiple times throughout the book of Joshua. Be strong and courageous. For thus the Lord will do to all your enemies against whom you fight. So, 1 army against 5, and it doesn't matter. One army against 5 different cities who have been established in this area for a long time, who have a jump start on the Israelites in already being on the field of battle first. And it doesn't matter because God gives them the victory. And Joshua wants the people to know, and wants the leaders to know in particular, this is the kind of victory that God will give us. In every battle going forward, if we rely on God, then we will do just fine. So Joshua puts these 5 kings to death and hangs them on 5 trees until evening. What is the point of that? Hanging the bodies of these kings from the trees until the end of the day? Yeah, so I mean, there's later on, that's something that happens to Jesus. Yeah.
That's kind of a foreboding of that,
Yeah, you do kind of see that looking forward to some of those events that happen with very different outcomes, of course, but still very similar. John was saying that making an example of them, making an example of them, dishonoring them. They have been defeated in battle and showing the people around that these 5 kings who stood up against God and who stood up against Israel have been defeated and killed and displayed in this dishonorable way, that they're not going to get to die peacefully in their sleep. They're not going to get to die some honorable death even on the field of battle. They're going to be put to death and their bodies hanged until the end of the day. And remember, this is this very long day, and so they've already had a longer than 24-hour period here that the Israelites are fighting, and that the sun has been frozen in the sky. But eventually, the day finally does come to a close. The sun goes down, and what do they do with the bodies of these kings once the sun goes down? Throw them back in the cave. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question.
Yes.
What would be the point of killing them and then hanging them?
So we think of hanging as like the way that some people are put to death, but literally hanging their bodies as a display of the fact that they died. So this was pretty common in a lot of civilizations. To do with criminals, to do with defeated people in battle, to do with people where you wanted to make a spectacle of their death. It's not just about killing them, it's about showing everyone around, look what happened to them. And so some people would put the heads of these people up on spears or up on pikes up high, or even the whole bodies of people up that way. You'd have things happening like that. Barry.
Well, it was a form of a curse.
Yeah.
Because it showed great disdain for this person.
Yeah.
And that they were just reprehensible. And so they would become a byword and those sorts of things.
Yeah.
As cursed as every man that hangs on a tree.
Yeah. Right. It's not the honorable way to die, and it's not a way of showing that that person is a person of honor. It's showing disdain for them. And yeah, we have that reference, cursed is he who hangs on a tree, which ends up getting applied to Jesus, which is interesting. Because he takes that curse, he is treated as a curse, as a dishonorable man, treated as a common criminal and rebel. And the way that subverts our expectations is interesting because, of course, Jesus is the one who has the highest honor, is the one who does not deserve this death. But it's precisely because of what Barry's talking about, because of what we're looking at here, that makes Jesus' death so meaningful. The fact that he hung on a cross is dramatically different than what you would expect for the king of the Jews, as they wrote, and the king of the world in reality. Mark.
Yeah, I just think that's so wonderful. It really is just so dramatic to see how God can turn something like sin into something that will save everybody.
Yeah.
It's exactly what you were talking about before, having that issue, thinking that this is foolishness. This can't be right.
Yeah.
The man is executed, and you're going to save everybody with it.
Yeah.
And that is really, I think, the power behind what God can do.
Yeah, absolutely. So the bodies of those kings are thrown into the cave that they were hiding in, seal that back up, and the writer of the book of Joshua says, and they remain there to this day, for whenever this book was written, and that kind of became a place of uncleanness, a place of curse that you don't go there. I'm not going to go into this cave because something unclean and dishonorable is here. So an interesting end to these 5 kings that have come up against Gibeon, come up against God, that God is still going to give them victory in this very dramatic way. Anything else you wanted to mention on that battle against defending Gibeon? Okay, so the next thing we've got for the end of chapter 10 is basically the southern campaign. So question number 4 asks, what is recorded in the rest of chapter 10 beyond what I just told you there? Mark.
We're just more conquering these southern cities. I think it's important to note at this point, they're still sticking to God's plan of complete annihilation.
Yeah.
We'll see that change eventually.
Right.
We're still in that plan.
Yes. So things seem to go pretty smoothly from here on out, for at least for a while, and they are sticking to God's plan of complete annihilation. We, of course, have looked in depth at certain battles that are significant to Israel figuring out what it is that they need to be doing. Jericho was very significant. Ai was significant for a different reason. The whole incident with Gibeon is very significant, but there's a lot of cities in this land. And the narrative is not going to go into the same level of detail for every one of these cities and every one of these kings. The book, even though this is a historical book, it is not a historical textbook. It is not trying to give a complete record of every single battle and every single city. And in fact, even historical textbooks don't really do that, right? We look at some things in more detail than others. Some things are reduced to footnotes or small summaries because, well, history just expands the more that you try to look at it. You can get into greater and greater detail on any one day, any one event, any one group of people. They have the same sort of thing happening here. So as dramatic and powerful as these previous examples were, now the narrative speeds up to start giving us a list of the different cities. And this is part of the southern campaign. I know this map is still hard to see like it was when I used it in the first lesson, but I don't really have a bigger one there. This red arrow here was the kind of central campaign, the first bit that they did crossing the Jordan and those first few battles. This green arrow, this is the southern campaign that we're talking about. So the end of chapter 10 is giving the list of cities that are involved in that campaign, that series of battles in taking more of the land. So when you look at how small this central area really is, we've gone through now 10 chapters of the book of Joshua covering really a pretty small area of this land. And now we're expanding it to get a larger chunk, but there's still quite a bit to come. So when you read down through it, you get basically the same sort of thing. They come up to a city, They capture it, they strike it, they devote it to destruction, they leave no one remaining, and they do to that city and to that king what they did to Jericho and to its king. And you follow that pattern, city after city. Anything that you want to bring up about that? Yes, Kathy.
One thing that I was thinking about is that it's interesting that when they went into the cities Ai and Jericho and I think Lachish, that they totally destroyed everything and burned it up. And my thought on that was that because the people and the land always heard of what was going to happen, it caused fear to be in their hearts. And so God told the Israelites from the beginning that they would be able to eat of the food and to work their farms and eat of the grapes and all that kind of stuff. So if he burnt the whole thing down, they wouldn't be able to do that. But a lot of cities, he just annihilated the people, but left all the houses and the vineyards and stuff like that, so that they could do that.
Right. And that's kind of what Mark was talking about there. Right here in the Southern campaign, really, we're still in that full-on destruction mode, that we're going to destroy everything and everyone. That's going to change, especially as we get into the next chapter, going up into a northern campaign, that they stop destroying these cities, at least not all of them. They start leaving some of the cities there and only killing the people for the reasons Kathy's talking about. Israel is not expected to rebuild everything from scratch. There are some of these cities that they should be inhabiting instead. So the people need to be destroyed, the people need to be killed, but now the Israelites are going to benefit from the city, the infrastructure that's already there, the wealth and resources that these areas have. They're not expected to level the entire country and then to rebuild cities from scratch. Not everywhere, at least, though they do that in some places. Yes?
My last point on that was, since the people on the land were fearing a lot, and they heard about how Joshua was destroying everything, it's interesting that when he did go to different cities, he had a different strategy so that the people couldn't figure out what he was going to do. He wasn't going to do the same thing every time.
Yeah. Right, yeah, that's it doesn't always happen in exactly the same way, and they're doing what God leads them to do in each place. But also, like you're bringing up this idea of the fear that the people had, and they do have it, but at the same time, they are also continuing to resist. And this becomes more evident when we get into chapter 11 here in a moment, that nobody else even tries what Gibeon tried in looking to make some sort of treaty with Israel. Nobody else does it. The only people, we have Rahab and her family, and then we have the Gibeonites who do it in a more underhanded way, and nobody else even tries. No matter how many cities that Joshua and the people go to, everyone is prepared to fight them instead. And that should tell you something about why God is judging the nation in this way, why these cities and these people are being destroyed. They have gotten that stubborn. They have gotten that hardened against God that it doesn't matter what they see, they still resist God. They still will fight against him, even when it becomes clear that Joshua and Israel are destroying city after city after city. Scott?
Yeah, with all that, you said earlier something about the history and the way it's recorded here.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's like history with a lesson.
Yes.
And that's this is really about God purifying the sin out of the land, right? And then his people can live in a land without sin. That's kind of
Yes.
the simplification of what is supposed to be happening. And so when we see it, for us, we have that lesson that, I mean, it constantly rings out of the way we're supposed to conquer sin in our lives. Whatever God says to do it, right?
Yeah.
And follow His way, and then sin is afraid. It runs from you.
Yeah.
It's easily conquered as long as you're on with the right army.
Yeah.
You're on God's side.
Yeah.
And He's fighting this battle, but He helps you do it. You do it, and you clear out all of this. And so, when you left none remaining, it's so important. That's just repeated throughout here. Every story has that, and that's when they're doing good and everything goes great. But I think the whole story of Israel and conquering that land is what happens when they don't follow all the way, right?
Right.
So we're going to see all that, but as we're reading it, if we just continually look at, how well have I done with this stuff?
Yeah.
And you can see little parts of your own life. You go, man, I need to really conquer this thing, or
Yeah.
let God conquer it and be done with it, and
Yeah.
get it completely out. And then I can start enjoying all these blessings that He has for us. It's kind of like the same thing with later on. He starts giving them some of the blessings of the land, right?
Yeah.
But in the beginning, you got to turn it all off.
Mhm.
It's just like that in our life.
Yeah.
Perspective.
It's history with a lesson, like you're saying, that God is purifying the land for them that they might enjoy the blessing the way that God intended for them. It's a land flowing with milk and honey, but what God envisions is not for Israel to have to coexist with a bunch of evil and pagan people who are constantly trying to pull them away from God. Like, that's not what God wants for them. And so the land is being purified that Israel might have the greatest enjoyment and the greatest peace in this land. They're working on that, and part of the story of Joshua is that they don't do it completely. And that ends up causing its own problems, and that has ripple effects going forward throughout the history of Israel. But still, we see what God intends for the people. And there's some good lessons there for us in what He intends for us to be living without sin, without these things corrupting our heart. Yes, Gary?
A lot of these verses are a summary, and as we read them, we can get the feeling that this happened quickly and easily.
Right.
But there is one verse in chapter 11 that says Joshua waged war with all these kings for a long time.
Yeah.
That kind of jumped out at me.
Yes.
I wasn't picturing it exactly that way.
Right.
Maybe even a parallel with what Scott was talking about.
Yeah.
Our lives, we spend all our lives fighting sin.
Right. That is a very important point to make here, that even though the narrative has sped up so much, that does not mean that the events are actually speeding up. So imagine if you're reading some summary of American history and it goes into great detail about the American Revolution, about our fight for independence from England, and lots of detail there. Then we get our independence, and then it kind of speeds up and races forward until the Civil War. Does that mean that the time period between the American Revolution and the Civil War was really short, really fast, and nothing interesting happened there? No, it's just, that particular historical summary is not really worried about the things that happened in between. It's jumping, from one to the other for whatever reason. I got the same thing going on here. All of these battles take time. They're traveling from one place to another. They're camping in different places. They're sieging different cities. They're engaged in all sorts of real wars and battles here. And as complicated as we see that Jericho gets, Ai gets, Gibeon gets, these sorts of things happen in these other cities as well. Just the reason why we have those others in more detail is there's more importance for the story of Israel and what they are learning. Jericho is a story of them learning that God gives victory and that they can overcome anything. Ai is a story of don't do things your own way, and when you go alone, you lose. When you go with God, you win. And Gibeon is a story of consult God before making hasty deals, and then, but once what's done is done, now go ahead and defend these people and let this be an expression of God's mercy. So there are other things that are happening after this, but of course it's speeding up. Kathy.
I think one thing that has to be realized is why God killed all these people. And I searched, and this past week I thought, I'm going to look up all the gods of the Canaanites, and I'm just going to see what it is. Because somebody's asked me, why did God kill all these people? I don't think you should have done that kind of thing.
Right.
So I went to Leviticus 18, and when you read all the sins there, then a person would begin to understand why God had to kill these people.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just a sin that was missing the Lord's Supper or something like that. I'm not saying that's a sin, but I'm just saying it's not something simple like that. These sins were abominations to God.
And
It's something that we have to look at today as well.
And they were repeated, reinforced. They were not they were unrepentant for generations. We talked about some of these things in the very first lesson we had about Joshua. It's a good reminder as you go through this because it's hard to swallow some of this. And you're right, Kathy, that a lot of people use the book of Joshua as an indictment against God, saying God should not have done this. This is not right. This is an evil and cruel thing that God is doing in destroying all of these people. It's mass murder. It's genocide. And the point of this is remembering that the Canaanites brought this judgment upon themselves, that they rejected God year after year, generation after generation. Their sin grew incredibly bold and incredibly wicked to where abominations were commonplace. They were ordinary, they were celebrated, they were perpetuated in every way, and they don't learn any lesson. And that's why I wanted to emphasize, and it comes up in the next chapter, that only Rahab and her family try to seek God, and only the Gibeonites try to do some sort of half measure of seeking God in a deceitful way. And that's it. Nobody else does anything. Nobody else tries to beg for mercy. Nobody else tries to see if there's a way out of this. The only thing that they can muster up is we must fight against God. That is a position that is hard to understand, but then it begins to make sense why God is being so harsh in this judgment against the people. Okay.
Well, it wasn't something that God rushed into.
Right.
He gave them time
Yeah.
to change. And when the time ran out, that was it.
Absolutely. Like God does with everyone, there's time, there's patience, there's opportunity to repent. We see God doing that with his own people over generations, that there was king after king that was wicked and leading the people, generation after generation of Israelites that had turned away from God. There were whole parts of history where they had actually lost the law of God. They didn't even have it in their possession anymore. And then there were whole sections of history where they had it, and they were following some version of it while they were worshiping pagan idols in their homes. And while they were setting up altars and holy places to these idols all over the country. So even Israel got that sort of patience from God in pushing them to repent. And God doesn't just do that with Israel as his chosen people. You think about how Nineveh got that message from God through Jonah that destruction is coming. You would think, well, Assyria, they're Israel's enemies. Nineveh is not part of God's chosen people. And so if God's unhappy with them, he'll just immediately destroy them. But the city repents, and so God stays his hand. That's what God does. But there comes a point where for so long you are resisting God as a people, as a nation, that God's patience runs out. And when time is up, then judgment comes. And because God has perfect justice and perfect righteousness, his judgment in that is sound. His judgment in that is correct. That when he is through, then it is the appropriate time for that judgment to take place. That's what's happening with the Canaanites, with all of these different kings and cities, but they have resisted God for so long that God is not going to be patient with them any longer. Dave.
Well, what's interesting about this to me is that, first off, God chose which cities. It wasn't a random pick, and the reason he chose them is they were military strongholds.
Yes.
There were many other Canaanite cities in the land they could have done.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it was a test.
Mhm.
I think they had to go fight these guys, and they get disappointed over, just like they did in Canaan when they took the spies in, right?
Yeah.
Oh, they're so big, but the whole point is Joshua didn't win anything on his own.
Right.
It's because God fought for Israel.
Yeah.
And that's the only reason they overcame the cities.
Absolutely.
I think it was a test that see if they would continue on. Because, bringing it in today's scenario, that's what Satan does to us. It's this perfect allegory to us. We come across our sins and we let them overtake us.
Yeah.
That's not, God's not going to fight for us now.
No.
I don't think, unless you're
No.
repent, but
Right.
I think that it's a good example for us to really look at and see in our own lives when we encounter these obstacles and these battles, if you will.
Yeah.
We need to let God fight for us.
That's the message of Joshua there. You're right. Jericho is not a great first choice to attack if you're trying to figure out how to be an army. That's an incredibly difficult city to overcome. But we're going to go get the military strongholds first because God can give victory. And then, the army stands by while the Ark of the Covenant marches around the city, while the priests, that's showing God is the one giving the victory. When they were defending Gibeon, it said that more people died from the hail that God rained upon the armies than by the swords of the Israelites. Kind of a consistent theme here, that Israel is a weapon in God's hand, but they are not doing this on their own. This is God's war, God's judgment, God's victory. Mark?
Yeah, because I'm kind of just playing off what you're talking about, how God allows mercy to those who seek him.
Mm-hmm.
This goes back to the promise to Abraham. So this is how long God's been giving them time to come around.
Mm-hmm.
He names these people, he talks about the sin of the Amorites, when he's making that oath with him. Abraham. And so it's not like God, didn't give them time. It was all of a sudden angry. This was their own undoing.
Yeah, absolutely. What should be sticking out to us here is how much the people of the land are not seeking God, are not seeking mercy, even as things develop. Maybe not a surprise that it doesn't happen at the beginning when Israel first gets there, but the longer this goes on and they're not seeking God at all, they're not seeking mercy, it just sticks out more and more and more. Gary?
Well, we keep bringing ourselves into the story, of course, we're supposed to. I think it's an important point that we have victories also, because we do express a lot that we fight sin, we make mistakes in sin. Scott and I have talked about this a lot, actually, over years. Jeffrey Wilcox and I were talking about this last night. get stronger, we obey God, and we were talking about the beauty in that, the strength in that. We do win battles,
Yeah, we do.
Christians.
Battles that we cannot win by our own efforts, too. That it's God that grants us that victory. It's a powerful thing. We've kind of been talking at some pieces of the Northern Campaign here. Chapter 11, your question 5 is what is recorded in chapter 11, and I've kind of told you already now. Going back to that, this big, long purple arrow here is a Northern Campaign that chapter 11 is talking about. And so it specifically says, and somebody brought this up, I think it was Gary that brought this up, that it's a long conflict, that these things are taking a long time. That's kind of implied in chapter 10. It's stated outright in chapter 11 that this is all taking a long time. And if you see how much longer of a distance they have to cover, well, that kind of makes sense. But also, there's some powerful strongholds up there. And in particular, Hazor stands out as this powerful city with a huge army that resists Israel. It says that, what is it exactly that it words it? Back towards the beginning of chapter 11, verse 4, it says, they came out with all their troops, a great horde in number like the sand that is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. So there's a lot going on in these battles, even though it's kind of going through their summaries quickly. There's some powerful armies that are up against Israel. And in this case, with Hazor, he has brought these other kings together with him, kind of like we saw with the king of Jerusalem bringing other kings into battle against Gibeon. Chapter 11, verse 1, we've got the king of Hazor bringing in the king of Madon and Shimron, and I can't say these names, all these cities that are around here, to band together and to fight against Israel. But they're even bolder than the king of Jerusalem was, that it's not, let's go fight Gibeon, let's go fight the ally of Israel, let's fight Israel themselves. And that battle is difficult and long, but God tells Joshua the same thing that he always tells him: do not be afraid. I will give over to them slain to Israel. He said, tomorrow this time, I will give over all of them slain to Israel. And they're able to defeat all of these armies. So this is the point in chapter 11 where specifically they stop destroying cities and they start just killing the people. Except for Hazor, they do destroy Hazor, but in general, these cities are left for them to occupy and to be able to use for their own benefit after the war. Beginning in verse 16, we are given a kind of a geographical summary of how far they had come. Verse 18 told us this all took a long time. And what I mentioned is found here in verse 19. There was not a city that made peace with the people of Israel except the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. They took them all in battle. Nobody even tried. Nobody sought mercy. So the main phase of the conquest is complete. In verse 23, it says, so Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. And that's an interesting statement because we're not as familiar with the geography of this area as we are with America, for example. But I want you to imagine some hypothetical invasion of America. And let's say I'm going to give you a summary of how this went. And say the army started in San Diego, and they took cities as far east as Louisiana, and as far north as Nebraska. And so they took the whole land of America. What stands out to you there? Yeah, it's not quite the whole land, right? Like, America goes farther than that. There's more beyond Louisiana. There's more beyond Nebraska. Like, it goes more than that. And we miss it because we're not as familiar with what these, where these cities are and what the borders are. But what we have mapped out in the cities they've taken is impressive, and it is a huge area of land that they have taken. But there's still some missing. So as much as they are celebrating victory and as much as they have taken the whole land, they've not taken everything that God had promised them. And that's going to become much clearer when we get to chapter 13, when God addresses that directly. Okay, you look like you got something to add?
Well, I was just thinking, you could kind of compare this with World War II, when they went from city to city.
Mhm.
You saw our troops fighting from city to city to city, and this is the same thing that's happening with this report.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Just going city by city, capturing these strongholds. Chapter 12 is really nothing new, and so it only kind of needs a note from us here. Chapter 12 is just a recap of what has been talked about so far. It's going back through all the cities that they've taken. What's kind of interesting is there are some cities listed here that weren't mentioned before, that obviously the historical record was not complete in the earlier chapters because we're hitting highlights. But chapter 12 is even a little more detailed of all the cities that they went to. And the way that this is worded is seen more easily in some translations than others. I kind of like how, where is this here? Yeah, so in the ESV and in some others, starting at about verse 9, it starts going through the list of the kings. And in the ESV, it says the king of Jericho, 1. The king of Ai, which is beside Bethel, 1. The king of Jerusalem, 1. The king of Hebron, 1. And that's kind of obscured in some of the other translations, and you're kind of like, what's the point of all this? This is like tallying up all the kings that God has been able to conquer. It's like we're marking it on the wall that they are just another tally in the list. All of these are powerful kings. All of these are quite capable of ruling a city, of ruling an area, of mustering an army, yet to God, and by extension to Israel, they're just another tally on the wall. And Israel has been able to conquer them without a problem. I find that significant. Kathy?
The interesting thing that was a surprise to me was that this only took 5 years.
Yeah.
It's only 5 years to capture everything. If you look at the front of Joshua, it'll give you the dates of Joshua.
Yeah. Okay. I'll have to check that out again there. I was missing that it was the 5 years there, but I'll trust you on that. Yeah, it's a long battle. It says that it's a long war, a long campaign, but it still is significant how easily God gives them victory. Mark?
Yeah, the stuff that I read, and I think Scott Nichols has a good references for this. It was recorded as 7 years, but as what Gary is saying, it is also recorded that it took a very long time. So 7 years is kind of this. Now there's control, but the campaign went on a lot longer.
Well, yeah, and chapter 13 is going to give even more detail about that, that even once they have gotten victory, control, that something good has happened, this is going to extend beyond Joshua's life even. So in one sense, it's quick and easy, and in another sense, it's going to be drawn out and become quite a long struggle. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your questions and comments. Next week, we will begin in chapter 13. Your next lesson covers 13 through 17.